Okay, excellent. So, yes, my name is Sthiramanas, and as Kuthlasara said, we've got this evening, and we'll be continuing our theme, exploring living with awareness, which is a title that comes from this book by Sangharakshita, who founded our Buddhist tradition, and it's his commentary on a very old Buddhist text. From the Pali Canon called the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the Buddha's very comprehensive and practical exploration of how we develop awareness, mindfulness, in different aspects of our life. So tonight we'll be exploring, we'll be talking about death mainly. So the Buddha goes into quite a lot of detail about how one can recollect death and dying, and why one might try and do that. So we'll be exploring that together. I think in the first half we'll mainly just talk about death a bit more in general, and perhaps explore a bit our responses to even talking about death. And then in the second half we'll go a bit more into. We'll look at what is said in the Satipatthana Sutta, and we'll look at some more practical ways that we might explore recollecting death in our practice. What I suggest we do now is that we get into pairs, and the question I want you to ask yourself and your partner and discuss is what happens. What's the effect when you do think about death? When you choose to think about death, or when a situation like this, I've suddenly said we're thinking about death tonight, what effect does that have? What effect does it have when you kind of can't but think about death because it's sort of there in your face in one way or another? What effect does that have on you? Any response is fine. So yeah, why don't you just get into a pair, ideally with someone that you don't know, and we'll discuss that for maybe 5 minutes, and then I'll hear back from you. Yeah. So who's up for sharing something that came up in your discussion on what happens when you think about death? Yeah.
I was talking about how I think there might even be a word for it in Sanskrit, but I always forget it. But it's this like attraction to oblivion, and that's not the same as a desire to die or a desire to escape reality. It's more of like a deeper attraction to encountering, like, I guess just what would be the mystery of consciousness or the universe. And so I think sometimes when I think about death, I think part of me gets like kind of excited in this way, because I'm so attracted to understanding whatever the concept of oblivion is. But obviously I'm terrified of death, and I don't want to die, and I never want to die. So it's like this really interesting kind of polarity. Part of me is very, very curious, and I feel it in my gut.
Yeah. So something potentially exhilarating about the idea of some sort of, whatever happens, it's a change. It'll be a big change. It'll be the biggest change we've had that we're aware of. And partly because it's a massive change, we'll be afraid of it, particularly if we are thinking of it as oblivion. If that's which is one way we can, isn't it? Where we think that's the end of everything. So that's quite terrifying.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, I was also saying that I feel like a deep dream state, to me at least intuitively, feels like there's like a hint. There's like hints in there of what like access to oblivion might be like.
Right.
And so I think maybe for me it's less like excitement about, there's going to be a change. Like I'm happy with things change enough as it is. But I think it's more like I'm so pulled into the dream state. I'm so curious about that, and I just want to go through the door just a bit more. Yeah.
Right. That's an interesting intuition, that the dream, that the state of being in a dream might be a clue to what comes after death. I think you might be onto something there. Yeah. Good. What else? Yeah.
I think like for me, in a search for kind of like this solidarity with other people, like death is just, especially with like say a difficult person, like if you kind of dehumanise them in a way, but then when you think of like the fact that I'm gonna die and I'm not here forever, and and so there's like a kind of like weird togetherness
Mm.
with it.
Right, yeah. So I think that kind of gets at the heart. So that perhaps particularly in doing the practice just now, in the way that we were doing the metabhavana, I think that it can get us right to the heart of the metabhavana, which is trying to enable us to connect with other people, not because I like them or not, or they're like one of my people, or they gave me a gift, or any of those sort of superficial things. We're trying to connect with other people on the basis of something universal, and the fact that we're beings who want to suffer, don't want to suffer, and want to be happy. And in a way, the fact that we're all going to die is the one, that is one thing that definitely connects all of us, and we sort of can know that. Yeah. What else? Maybe one more thought. Yes.
Yeah, strangely, I brought a book, John Lewis, today called A Good Death. How to have a good death, because I'm going to die soon, very soon. So what we're talking about today is quite permanent. And when I got the diagnosis, it was quite revolutionary to the way I saw things thereafter. I was looking at every moment with a different perspective, and it's not frightening, but it's just a different perspective you do have.
Can you say more about what that different perspective?
Well, you just enjoy the silly things like having a wash in the morning and making the food, and those sorts of things become very important. And if you can clock another day, then that's great. So, but the steroids probably help all that as well.
Great, thanks for showing
so
that.
You need a sense of humour as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it's a really helpful perspective, isn't it? It's like suddenly in knowing we're going to die, which is true for all of us in a way. Some of us it might not be as soon, but in a way, in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty soon for all of us. And seems to put the spotlight on is just the act of what it is like to be alive, and the kind of the little things, as you say, of a day that we can so easily just forget about on our pursuit of trying to get somewhere else that we're imagining in the future. If we stop imagining that future so solidly, suddenly you've got the actual stuff of being alive. I think a sort of sense of beauty and a sense of enjoyment, and a sense of humour probably necessary with all of that as well. Yeah, thank you. So, just a couple of thoughts before we pause on this. So, I'm sure there's lots of other responses in the room. In a way, it'd be nice to hear from lots of you on this, because it can elicit any number of responses reflecting on death in this way. It can this sense of excitement, or a sense of sort of beauty and ease and connectedness and so on. But it can also, elicit some fear, a sense of a kind of, sometimes we can think about death with a kind of sort of numb, morbid kind of fascination or something. We could sort of wish for it in a kind of desire for nothingness kind of way. We could sort of feel a bit depressed. There's all sorts of things that could happen when we relate to it in this way. Or it could open something up in a really positive way. And it very much is going to depend on the mental state with which we're approaching it. So that's really key in this practice. That's really key if we're going to engage actively with reflecting on death. But it's going to be important because at some point or another we're going to have to face it. So we might as well put ourselves in the mental state where we can. So this is where cultivating mindfulness, cultivating an awareness of what all of our various different reactions are and how we are and how we're feeling, so that those different sort of parts of ourself, if you like, those different sort of volitions and so on and feelings that we have can kind of be held together rather than kind of fighting against one another outside of our awareness. And also cultivating metta, as we've been doing, gives this kind of emotional richness, ballast, so that we're sort of able to face the more difficult aspects of life, because we're looking at life in a big enough, emotionally big enough perspective. But also how we respond when we think about death will be very much affected by what our views are of death and what happens when we die. I'm not going to go into this very much tonight. That could be a whole other talk in itself in terms of the Buddhist perspective of what happens when we die. But probably the most common, probably for most of us, whether we think this consciously or whether we've just sort of absorbed it from the world around us, most of us probably have some sense that we die and then that's it, and that's lights out. Because that seems to be one of the most prevalent views of death that is sort of around us. And to the extent that we hold that, death will be quite a scary thing, because the idea of a sort of, we've got all this experience and stuff that's going on, the idea of that being cut off and there being nothing is understandably quite scary. It also gives a sense that sort of death and therefore the life before it is kind of ultimately meaningless, because there's this off switch and then it's just all sort of stopped. So that isn't the Buddhist perspective of what happens when we die. The main thing to say about a Buddhist perspective on what happens when we die is that death isn't the end. There's lots of different religious traditions and other traditions that look at this in different ways. None of us really know for ourselves what happens when we die. We are going to have to find out. There's only one way to find out. But the Buddhist perspective is that it isn't an end. Buddhism talks in terms of rebirth. So that's not quite a reincarnation in the sense that you might think, well, here I am here, and then in the next life I'll be someone called with a different name, or a frog, or something like that. Hopefully not a frog. But in a way, that the Buddhist tradition would point out the fact that, in a sense, I can't find a me called Sthiramanas in here in the first place, let alone take that me called Sthiramanas and plonk it into another body over there. So there's something more unknowable going on. But that there is some sort of continuity, that consciousness doesn't just get cut off and end, which I think for me, there was a moment where I realised that I don't know this for myself. I've got a trust in the Buddhist tradition generally, because I've seen how the practices work for myself and other people. But I've logically, I became more open to this idea, partly because it just seems to make sense to me that if you've got a context where, say, the body dies, and then all the different elements of the body will if you're buried, it'll dissolve, it'll be eaten, it'll go back into the earth. There's a kind of continuance of all the sort of physical aspects of the body. So it doesn't seem to make sense to me why there would be a discontinuance with consciousness. Why would that stop when everything else seems to sort of move on and change form in other ways? Also I don't see why that wouldn't just be an ongoing process rather than this sense of there being a life and then that moves into an afterlife and it's 1 and 2 and that's it. There's the sort of sense of a sort of ongoing sort of cycle of movement, a sort of organic kind of movement seems to make sense to me. In a way, we all just the main thing is just to see if we can just be open to the fact that we don't really know. If we've got a very fixed sense of this is what happens when I die, then that's going to be limiting us in one way or another. We can just see it, we don't actually know, so we could explore other sort of possibilities. And the main thing about death not being the end is it opens up much more positive ways of relating to what's going to happen. We can see the Buddhist tradition would say that death is probably the best opportunity we'll have to gain enlightenment, because there's a sudden letting go of in a way that we're trying to do in meditation but might struggle to. When the body dies, there's a letting go into something new. There's a real opportunity there. there's a sense that could be exhilaratingly freeing. The body can be constraining and tight and stressed and painful and achy and all of these things. To be free from that somehow, there's a potential of something for the consciousness to be free from the body in that way, could be a very exciting prospect. The one I'll leave us for this half before we have some tea with a quote. I won't try and sort of explain it because I don't really know how to, but I really like it, which is from the Bengali poet Rabindranath Tagore, who says, "I know I shall love death because I have loved life." Saying that death and life, you can't have one without the other. They're the two sides of the same coin. I know I shall love death because I have loved life. So I'll just leave us with that, and let's get some tea, and we'll come back and explore how we might recollect death in our life and in our practice. Okay, so we're exploring all of this in the context of the Satipatthana Sutta. So I'm going to read you a section of the Satipatthana Sutta where this kind of theme comes from. So this is instruction for practice of awareness. Again, bhikkhus, as though he were to see a corpse thrown aside in a charnel ground, 1, 2, or 3 days dead, bloated, livid, and oozing matter, a bhikkhu compares this same body with it thus: this body too is of the same nature. It will be like that. It is not exempt from that fate. Again, as though he were to see a corpse thrown aside in a charnel ground, being devoured by crows, hawks, vultures, dogs, jackals, or various kinds of worms. A bhikkhu compares this same body with it thus: this body too is of the same nature. It will be like that. It is not exempt from that fate. Again, as though he were to see a corpse thrown aside in a charnel ground, a skeleton with flesh and blood held together with sinews. A fleshless skeleton smeared with blood held together with sinews. A skeleton without flesh and blood held together with sinews. Disconnected bones scattered in all directions. Here a hand bone, there a foot bone, here a shin bone, there a thigh bone, here a hip bone, there a backbone, here a rib bone, there a breastbone, here an arm bone, there a shoulder bone, here a neck bone, there a jawbone, here a tooth, there the skull. A bhikkhu compares this same body with it thus: this body too is of the same nature. It will be like that. It is not exempt from that fate. That too is how the bhikkhu abides contemplating the body as a body. Again, as though he were to see a corpse thrown aside in a charnel ground, bones bleached white, the colour of shells, bones heaped up, more than a year old, bones rotted and crumbling to dust. A bhikkhu compares this same body with it thus: this body too is of the same nature. It will be like that. It is not exempt from that fate. So I hope you enjoyed your tea and biscuits. So in a way, this when it's saying what's the exact phrasing again? It says as though he were to see a corpse, etc. Much of the time in the Buddhist tradition, it's not an as though, it's not an imaginative exercise. There would be an active decision to go to a charnel ground and see a dead body and contemplate on it in that way. And the Buddhist, in aspects of the Buddhist tradition, people have really followed that through and made a real practice of going to cremation grounds, going to places where bodies are burned, etc., and being a place to meditate. So yeah. Anyway, I want to sort of, I guess, what? Just a question, and just chuck out any first response, a word or two. What effect would that have to do that? What can you imagine the effect would be of practicing in that way? It's quite full on. We don't tend to recommend it here, but yeah. What would you think? Yeah.
I think it would be quite energetic.
Mm-hmm.
Like you would have to deal with your own fears
Mm-hmm.
as you like enter that sort of space with a lot of dead bodies.
Yeah.
And yeah, you have to deal with the energy of this space as well. So it would be, you just have to quell your fears first of all, and then allow yourself to just sit in the energy.
Yeah.
And see what comes up.
Great. Yeah, really good response. Yeah, so first of all, facing the fear of being in a place like that, or seeing death in that very visceral way that's described, and there being a lot of energy involved with that, both in yourself and also potentially sort of sense of there being a lot of energy in the space. Yeah, great. What else? Even if it's just like disgust and horror, that's legitimate as well. What would?
I suppose it might maybe spark your imagination a bit further.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than, because sometimes in Buddhism you can start visions and go to different places and things, and I think maybe that might be sort of the most natural condition to do it in, maybe.
Right.
I don't know.
Natural
Condition to kind of, contemplate what's going to happen, what the whole premise. But I mean, I quite like the idea.
Yeah. So the sense of the imagination being sparked off in a place like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So sort of deepen the connection of it, deepen your practice of it.
Yeah.
It's a bit like here, when you're meditating with other people, it has a different feel to it rather than if you're on your own.
Yeah.
At home, you can go much deeper in the practice in some way.
Yeah. Yeah, the context of our practice affects our practice. If you were to sit in a really, really beautiful spot and meditate, chances are that would affect your meditation, probably quite positively. Similarly, if you were to sit in like a neon office and meditate, it would probably affect it in another way. If you were to meditate in this kind of context, that would really highlight the existential sort of situation, wouldn't it? That would do something. Yeah. And I think one thing to say with this as well is it would. I imagine if I were to go to a charnel ground that's described as such, I think I'd like to think I would feel excited to be able to practice. It's something that does actually appeal to me somehow. I also think probably more likely it would sort of turn my stomach and get me quite scared, and it would have all sorts of other effects that, this is a very, very strong medicine that's being talked about here. So it's not actually it's not something I'm recommending that you go home and do, but it's there in the Buddhist tradition for people who are very committedly practicing, and we can explore why that might be. I'm going to read a little section from Bhante Sangharakshita, my teacher, talking about this kind of practice, basically. He says, the experience that arises is very much one of exhilaration and zest and enthusiasm for getting on with the spiritual life, as well as a very positive kind of detachment. It's certainly not a dull and depressing experience. If you think that it's likely to be that, then that type of practice isn't for you. You should feel exhilarated after visiting the cemetery, not depressed. If it makes you depressed, don't do it. Depression isn't very helpful. In Tibetan Buddhism especially, we find that they engage in these practices in a very positive spirit and make use of human skins and human skulls with a kind of glee. they're not at all depressed or sorrowful or melancholy, because they really do rise above the ego. They really do get a much loftier perspective on things, really do see the whole chain of birth and death, and feel themselves a bit detached from that, and really rising above it, and getting onto the spiritual path that leads beyond reincarnation. Thus, it's all very, very positive and very inspiring. There's nothing morbid or melancholy about these practices, not when they are done in the right way and by the person to whom they are suited. So you can hear lots of caveats in there in terms of why not to do it. So it's something we need to sort of know ourselves in how we engage in these kind of reflections and know what effect it's having. And if we're getting depressed and discombobulated, well, that's not the aim. So it's not, whatever we're doing is not working right now. But yeah, this sense of there being, this creating an enthusiasm for getting on with the spiritual life. The fact that reflecting on death in this very immediate way can generate an enthusiasm for practice. When we reflect on death, we know that we've only got limited time. And if we find that cultivating our mind in the way that Buddhist practice is teaching us to, is a worthwhile use of our life, and that's certainly my experience when I practice, in a way, the fact that we know that we've only got so long and we don't know when it's going to end, means that that's motivation. That's a force of motivation to practice. So that's one way that reflecting on death and impermanence is a help. But also it kind of puts us in touch with puts our practice a bit more in touch with a greater mystery. So that it's not just about trying to get more productive or into happier mental states or whatever. We're practicing almost as a preparation for death, as a preparation for this great opportunity of this moment where we're sort of released into the unknown in some way. So it's putting our practice in a much broader context, a context that goes beyond life and death even. And he also talks about this kind of not melancholy, but I think one word that I think we could use instead of melancholy is perhaps poignancy, because it does sometimes when we're reflecting in this way, or when we are affected by death and are able to relate to it from a emotionally positive place. It's not that we're jumping for joy necessarily. There can be a quality of something very sort of quiet and spacious and poignant. It's like the sort of, in relation to the tragedy of life, you've kind of got the comedy of life as well. It's like the sort of, you sort of got both together. There's the sort of the sense that, that it is ending and that it is kind of beautiful and sort of even humorous. There's something about that state that sort of, I feel like it's not quite melancholy because that implies a sort of depressive element, but a kind of poignant, rich, meaningful kind of quality. And he also talks about creating a very positive kind of detachment, And I think you can sort of see that if we're looking at a corpse, as you do. I haven't said that for a while. If we're looking at a corpse, what we're seeing in the descriptions that we've heard is how that all kind of disintegrates and returns to the natural world. It's clear that the body is just part of nature and returns to it, and the sort of that which is fluid sort of seeps into the earth. That which is temperature re-enters, the air around it. The last breath is breathed out. That which is sort of solid kind of disintegrates or is eaten or is whatever. There's a continuation of that. And what we can sort of notice is just that, it was never mine in the first place. Because it's come from there as well, isn't it? It's come from, our body is built up from basically what we eat and what we breathe in and what we drink and so on. And then by all sorts of clever means, the body kind of converts that all into me, into what I think of as me when I sort of hold my body or whatever. That comes from the world around us, and at the point of death it will return to it. And rather than the point of death being the moment where we're sort of we're sort of told that we are no more, or we're stripped of something that was ours, which just never was ours in that way. And this kind of positive detachment means that we can sort of somehow just stop holding on to it in the same kind of way. There's this very, very natural sort of tense, grasping kind of quality that we're doing all the time at very, very subtle, even at very, very subtle levels, whereby we're kind of hanging on to things being a certain way, whether that's our job remaining our job, or our partner remaining our partner, or our face not aging, or whatever it is. Even just our body being our body, we're sort of clinging on to it all the time, and there's a suffering that comes with that. In the Buddhist tradition, we would say that is the source of suffering. That all comes out of that. If we could hold more lightly to it, if we could see our life and the stuff of our life within a perspective that includes life and death, and all these everything else that's going on, and all these other people, and the sort of the world and the universe and so on, there'd be no reason to just grab hold of this tiny little bit of it. So by seeing the facts of life in that way, by seeing the fact that this body was never mine in the first place, I can't really point at the me whose it is, then we can slowly sort of detach and relax in relation to it, which just means that A, we don't suffer so much, and B, we can then get on. It's not that I disappear or anything like that. Nothing's actually sort of changed beyond just letting go of a particular delusion. So what we're left with is the same ability to think and speak and act in the world, but kind of released, freer, and all of the energy and clarity and fellow feeling that we're told comes from that. The Buddha being the sort of the fruition of that process. So partly what we're really having to do is learn to face the unpalatable. This practice is really taking us into it by going into a charnel ground and looking at bodies with blood-smeared skeletons and so on. We're learning to just look at the thing that we don't want to look at, which is the fact that we're going to die. The more painful, the more unpleasant aspects of life that we tend to shy away from. And you notice this by it's very easy when someone dies. Quite often we don't want to say that they've died. We might say that they've passed on, or they've passed over, or they're not with us anymore. It's all euphemism, isn't it? That's stopping us from saying, no, they died, they're dead. We know what that means, and it's a sort of facing of it. It manifests in how we do funerals as well. So, quite a lot of funerals that I've been to in my life, I haven't been to that many actually. I'm sort of relatively fortunate in that so far. That will change, but a lot of the funerals that I've been to, there's this sense that you sort of arrive at a place, and then there's a coffin. There's a sort of a very nicely lacquered box that kind of comes in for a bit, and then it's kind of taken away from the side. It's almost not central. Certainly, the body, the person's body, is hidden in some way, and it's sort of made an excuse of. I was in India at the start of this year, and myself and a few friends we were going to a convention of our order at Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha gained enlightenment. And on the way there, we went to Varanasi, it's sort of famed for this. It's on the river Ganges, and particularly in the Hindu tradition, it's sort of the Ganges is seen as very much a sacred river, and so people go to Varanasi to die. It's thought to be very, very auspicious to die in Varanasi, and there is a tradition. The Hindu tradition is much more one of cremation, where the bodies are much more visible, and there's a sort of almost more of a celebratory atmosphere around bringing the body to the Ganges, washing the body in the Ganges, and burning it. And walking along the river, you just see quite a lot of that. And there's quite an atmosphere to it. Some of the atmosphere wasn't always there was something almost slightly kind of occult or something that I didn't always feel was completely positive. But that wasn't always the case, and there was just this sort of very vivid sense of being around life and death. Particularly poignant moment. We were standing at one burning ghats, and there was all these corpses, and there was them generally wrapped in white, but there was one wrapped in black. And this chap who was local sort of explained to me and a friend that when the body's wrapped in black, it's because they're unidentified. No one knows whose body it is. And he pointed out that's why it was being watched by a solitary policeman whose job it was. He's paid to do this. The state pays for people to take an unidentified body to Varanasi and see that it's burned at Varanasi, so that it may suit its sort of future afterlife. Very poignant scene, just watching this one policeman stand, smoke a cigarette, and watch this unidentified body burn sort of in the dusk at the side of this river. So there was just something about being there. It was just very, very alive. The whole place was sort of something about being around death in that kind of way. That sort of, you were talking about the energy of the place being around death. Very much my experience, that there's a sort of almost like your hairs on your arms sort of stand up in the atmosphere of the place. So different to my experience of a funeral with a lacquered box. One thing I really like, I love going to funerals here at the RBC when I've been to a handful of them, and it's not quite a funeral. It's not quite the lacquered box because we'll tend to have an open casket so you can see the body. So I think the first time I saw dead bodies was in this room actually at a funeral, which just means there's this sort of weighty thing in the middle of the room, literally and metaphorically. You can see that was the person, and they don't look like them anymore. But there's something very sort of affecting about that. It's like we're not sort of masking what's going on here, but we are meeting together around it. And so I really like that about it, and I also like the fact that we gather and then we do ritual together. Going to any sort of secular funeral, I've really felt like it's like we don't quite know what to do. Someone's died, we don't really know what that means. We're all a bit embarrassed about it, and so we sort of get through this bit so that we can go and have a drink. And there's something about coming together and doing a ritual, doing a Buddhist ritual, and evoking the sort of universal sort of vision and purpose of Buddhist practice. And sort of seeing off this person who we can see in the context of that feels really sort of feels like there's a weight to it, and you can kind of mark this fact and mark a life. And the other thing I really like about them is that there's a big feature of rejoicing in them. So people will stand up and will talk about this person and what they were like, and what qualities they had and what we remember of them. So there's a real atmosphere of kind of celebration. It sort of, by rejoicing in the merits of someone, you really evoke them. It's like you get this when you rejoice in someone who's alive. It's like that person's qualities kind of fill the room, and everyone who's listening kind of experiences them and somewhat absorbs them. If we're inspired by the qualities of a person, we tend to want to emulate it. So all that just to say, I think we do funerals really well here. If you ever get the chance to come to one, do. Yeah. Anyway, mainly I think what I'm suggesting is that we do recollect death. I'm suggesting that much more than I suggest that you go you go to a cremation ground and do all of this stuff. But let's take the sort of essential principle underneath it and just try and really see if we can recollect death more in our life. So let's just get into pairs again briefly and just see, probably a little bit shorter than last time, but how could you do that more? What could you and I meant to say, if you're online, this would be a really good moment to do any written you could get a piece of paper and just do some written reflection whenever we're doing this. In pairs, how could you bring this recollection of death more into your life? What are the things that you could do that could help you remember death? So again, would anybody really be willing to share any reflections that's come up out of that?
Flowers, to contemplate death.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to use them just because they die
Yeah.
a lot all the time, but it doesn't stop them from blooming
Mm.
and being beautiful.
Mm.
So yeah, I tend to get flowers for myself and just to try to keep them alive for as long as possible, and then leave them to die, and then get new ones after they die. Yeah.
It's very traditional in a way. It's one of the 3 traditional things to offer to a shrine. We've got all these beautiful flowers here, and a big part of it is that they're there for a moment. And that's And see how?
I guess one thing that came up for me is being aware of change in time passing.
Mm-hmm.
Time can be actually a very strange thing when you think about it. And this is something I've been thinking about recently, is that when you're older, it's not going to matter that you were once young. And last week, it doesn't matter that last week happened. You're here now. It'll feel like an instant. You will be looking back 20 years in the future. As we are looking back now, it won't matter that there was. You see what I mean? It'll be like instant. It's all almost stacked on top of each other. It's not gonna. It'll be like an instant in a week. In a week, this moment will be completely gone, and we'll be sitting there thinking, feeling as though we are feeling right now.
Yeah, I sort of chimes with an intuition I had a while ago. Where we talk about how it feels like time speeds up as you get older. I wonder if there's a sense that when I remember being really little, and then feeling like, but everyone tells me I'm really little, but I feel like I've been alive for forever. Do you know what I mean? It's like it feels like my life's gone on for this really long time, but everyone says I'm only 4 or whatever it is. And I wonder if my sense of how long I've been alive sort of on a fundamental level stays the same, but there's just more and more content that kind of fills it up, and therefore each year or whatever ends up sort of occupying less space within that. Don't know if that's true or not, but that was a sort of one more way of recollecting death you could do.
I really struggle.
Mm.
I really struggle. I realise actually talking about it, I never ever consider it ever.
Mm.
If I'm honest, I'm in a dark place a lot of the time, and I just think in comparison, even death doesn't really come to me. If it does, I think it would even be like a relief sometimes, which sounds a bit strong, but I'm sort of really struggling to recollect it. But I think after this, I might try and sort of incorporate into my meditation, just remind myself of the impermanent, just the awareness that life is all connected. Life and death, they're all sort of one energies in a way, and like you say, you don't know where your body comes from. You don't know where. I get a bit freaked out sometimes because I don't know why the trees are there, or why this is there, or why I'm here. It sounds a bit zany, but I don't know. So I guess I think for me, because we're all sort of obsessed with being in our own entity, we'll consider, we're our own entity. This is my body. This is my mind. And I think, especially, I went on a retreat recently, and there was a lot of realisations, and I really sort of got that sense of not just focusing on myself as an entity, as a separate entity, and just trying to be aware of, in it, you know, what of I don't know, the fragility of things like nature, and you know, how did this flower come into my, you know, into existence, and I don't know where I'm going.
So what you're getting at is that it sort of opens as a sort of a sense of a mystery and a sense of sort of wonder and awe and beauty, and that can come with that. Is that right?
For me, that sort of creates intense fear in me, and I don't think of it as. I don't know. I think that's another. Yeah. I don't know. I think uncertainty is a really scary thing for me. So maybe that's why I never consider it. I don't know.
Sure. And it might be that there's a right place and time for it as well. It's like the cultivating mindfulness and cultivating metta are the sort of foundation for this. And it might be that that's the right focus to begin with, and then moments when we're in a more positive state, it's more possible to reflect in this kind of way. The other thing is to sort of, you know, if we're looking at impermanence in general, death is obviously looking at an ending, but part of impermanence is the fact that things are just changing. That doesn't necessarily mean everything's ending. It means that everything's coming into being as well. So that, in a way, we can have, again, it is still opening us up to a kind of mystery and a kind of a sort of instability and so on. But within that, there's a lot that's sort of new and fresh and inspiring. And there's different ways of looking at them, and particularly if we're not in a particularly positive place, that might be more of an appropriate sort of approach to take to it. Yeah. So I just want to. Anyway, I thought of 3 particular things that we could have as sort of takeaways. That we could do to recollect death more in our lives. So, first thing is make a will. Even if you're in your 20s, make a will. Just treat it as a practice. I mean, it's something that when you do die will make other people's lives a lot easier. Like a lot easier if you've been clear about what you want to happen when you die, where you want your things to go, who you want to have your guitar, who you want to give your money in your bank account to, how you want to have a funeral. If you want a Buddhist funeral, important to make that clear if you do, etc., etc. So, but mainly it's a practice. It's a practice of having to put yourself into the mindset of all the little practical things of what a world without you in it would look like. And it's quite affecting. I did one a number of years ago, just before I was ordained. And it was little things like, so what things what do I want to happen to my things? Like, there are some things that I sort of care a lot about. It's, I would quite like that person to have that, or what would I want? What would I want to happen to my body, etc. It's like suddenly we're thinking of this as a reality, and we often don't get practical in that kind of way. So it's quite a sort of strong practice.
I think when it's writing a will, obviously there'll probably many young people in here that may or may not think about writing a will, but I think, is it the case that obviously as a 20-year-old or even a 50-year-old, you won't think about writing a will? Is it just because you not ready to face death?
Quite possibly. I mean, must be part of it. It's that you just don't think you need it yet.
Yeah, you just
but
don't need it. I can live 10 years, 20 years, but the case is...
But you might not.
Might not.
Yeah. So it helps you to remember that you might not. And, in the event that you don't, it will really help others. So, I mean, there are online templates you could use, do that very easily. There's an older member called Satchidasa who normally sort of lives in the UK, and he does this as a sort of living. He's very good and helpful and cheap. So there's lots of ways to sort of do that. I'd really encourage that. The second thing, more broadly, is just to remember, just to keep remembering you can say to yourself every now and then, when you're in a more positive state, I'm going to die. I am going to die. I'm going to die. And in a way, we need to just, on a certain level, of course we know that, but we don't, at the same time, we don't really know that. We do actually need to convince ourselves of that fact, particularly if we're young. It's very easy just to think, oh, it will happen later. And we sort of think, it'll happen later, to the point where we think it will maybe just never happen on some sort of deep level. And there is something about allowing it to just sort of slowly sink in. I turned 35 the other day, and I was realising that's halfway to 70. It's like, okay, so I've lived half of my life that happens before I'm 70, and 70 in my book is quite old. So it's like, right, okay, it's this slow sort of dawning of things like, okay, so I don't have as much time as I thought I did, or I used to think that I did, etc. Hopefully there's more of those realizations that come. I think it will probably get a bit easier to remember this as you get older, but in general, just can we really keep it forefront in our mind? It'll happen whether we're ready or not, and we don't know when it will happen. It won't necessarily be when we've sort of got all of our ducks in a row and we've written our will and we've done all this. It could just happen at any time. But also remembering that others will die as well. The people that we love in our life will all die at some point. And that can be a really helpful thing to remember, particularly because it can help us to remember to really value them. My aunt is quite close to death at the moment. She'll be one of the first people that I've been really close to that will have died, actually. I've had people in my life die, but no one that I've no close family members really. But she's not got very much longer to live. And knowing that has been really, really positive, because I've been just trying to see much more of her. And she's got loads. We just had some really sort of intimate conversations that we wouldn't have sort of had otherwise. So it's been a gift to sort of know that that's coming and it not be a sudden surprise. But then, my dad is 82 and he's in pretty good health. His dad died of a heart attack, and that was when he was my dad was in his 20s, so that was quite a shock. So it's just like, what could happen? Something like that could happen any time. And if I can, to the extent that I can remember that, when I spend time with him, or ideally with anyone, because it could happen to someone whether they're young or old, then you've got this sense that, there's not necessarily going to be loads of next times I see them. If you went into a meeting with someone, or to spend some time with someone, thinking this could be the last time I see them, it would change the way you relate to them. It would be a richer experience relating to them. And lastly, I just want to suggest that you give it all this space. So it's like if you really force this kind of reflection, then we can sort of freak ourselves out a bit, basically. I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. There's ways that we could sort of shake ourselves up unnecessarily. So really emphasis on working on being in positive mental states in order to deepen our in order to get a wiser perspective on life in this kind of way. We need to kind of develop a kind of open, receptive sort of space in which this kind of thing can just sort of sink in. And there are in a way, the prime time for this kind of reflection is where we don't even really need to reflect on impermanence and death, because it's just happened to us in some way. Either we might have found out that we're going to die sooner than we thought. We might have found out that a loved one is going to die. Someone might just have died suddenly or otherwise. In those moments, it's like you don't need to, no one needs to tell you, remember to reflect on death, because it's there, it's very present. And what we can just try and do in that moment is to actually give it space, to just try not to distract ourselves from the fact of that, and just give it the space and put us and do so in as positive a mental state as we can put ourselves in, to just really absorb it, just really absorb the fact that that's happening. Bhante Sangha actually said that the best opportunity that we have for insight is bereavements and breakups, he said as well, which in a certain sense a breakup of a relationship is a bit like a bereavement, because that relationship, that person, the way that we know them, that's ended. You don't get to talk to them in that same way anymore. So those are prime opportunities for insight to arise. That doesn't mean some sort of complex sort of reflection on the nature of self and all of this. It's just letting it sink in, the fact that death's a thing, that this person's gone, etc. But the only way that will happen is if you can really create space around it, and just really be aware enough of your experience to just see what effect that has.